think it's been a very clear intention from our government not to really excavate further into which are the roots and the causes that have, that are behind this health crisis, this near pandemic that we're living today. Well, the World Health Organization has already called it a pandemic, and they say it's unstoppable. But if we don't redress the whole economic model that stands on the lack of environmental and labor, the exploitation of environmental and labor, lack of regulations and enforcement, we will continue to see the multiplication of this kind of crisis.
And Manuel, you also talk about there's an alternative summit going on right now with a big protest march planned. Could you talk about that?
Well, the alternative summit happened from Saturday until yesterday, and there were at least 60 organizations from Mexico, Canada, and the U.S. that were there to send a message to the three presidents that we need another model, a new economic model. And this is where I think it was a missed opportunity, and I agree with Laura, a step backwards, that they didn't take this opportunity to start discussing a new economic model, to start redressing all these problems, to start redressing also the deep economic and social crisis that Mexico is experimenting today. The reason why Mexico is contracting almost, well, in the month of May, the economy contracted 10%. And this year, the forecast is that the economy will shrink about 7 or 8%. This is a much bigger contraction than any other country in Latin America. And the reason why this contraction is happening is because of Mexico's dependence to the United States economy. 80% of Mexico's exports go to the U.S. economy. And it's not Mexican exports. It's the exports of U.S. companies exporting from Mexico to the United States. And many of these are, for example, the car companies, Chrysler, Ford, General Motors, that have contracted and have succumbed. And this is why they're not exporting so much from Mexico to the United States. And this is the reason why Mexico is shrinking so much. So we have to change the model, and Mexico has to start growing internally.
Manuel Perez Roca is with the Institute for Policy Studies, a member of the Mexican Action Network on Free Trade. Laura Carlson's joining us from Mexico City. She's director of the Americas Program at the International Relations Center. When we come back, we're going to also talk about other issues raised at the summit. We'll talk about the drug war and the coup in Honduras. Stay with us. Maná as a world-famous Mexican rock band from Guadalajara singing Justice, Land, Freedom. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Truffaut Caduce as we continue on the Mexican summit, what they're calling the Three Amigos Summit. Laura Carlson, I want to ask you about Honduras. On Monday, President Obama responded to criticism the U.S. hasn't done enough to oppose the Honduran coup regime.
The same critics who say that the United States has not intervened enough in Honduras are the same people who say that we're always intervening and Yankees need to get out of Latin America. You can't have it both ways. If these critics think that it's appropriate for us to suddenly act in ways that in every other context they consider inappropriate, then I think what that indicates is that maybe there's some hypocrisy involved in their approach to U.S. Latin American relations that that certainly is not going to guide my administration's policies.
That's President Obama speaking at a news conference at the Three Amigos Summit in Guadalajara. Laura Carlson, you've been following the developments of the coup in Honduras. Your response to President Obama basically calling critics of the U.S. not doing more to oppose the coup hypocrites?
I was shocked and insulted at that statement as one of those people who's been calling for stronger statements, sanctions from the United States. It was a snide and petty remark. And besides that, it's just not accurate. Intervention is when you get involved in external affairs. What we've been calling for is for the United States to do exactly as the European Union and other countries across the world have done, which is to apply the sanctions that are called for in U.S. legislation to cut off aid to an illegal military coup, or also to withdraw an ambassador who no longer has a valid counterpart in the country. So that's not intervention. That's simply following and being consistent with the policies and the laws in the United States. This comment was a real disappointment because it's necessary that those sanctions be applied and that the ambassador be withdrawn. We've been in constant contact with the Honduran grassroots organizations, which, according to polls, the majority of the people in Honduras that are in the streets, that are fighting the illegal coup, a coup that's been proclaimed by the OAS, the Organization of American States, by the United Nations, by every nation in the world. And what they're saying is, we're doing our part. We need the United States to stop aid to this coup so that we can finally restore democracy in the country. And this comment didn't help.
Laura Carlson, Zelaya was just in Mexico meeting with the Mexican president, meeting with Calderon, and also gave a major speech in Mexico City. Describe what he was saying, what he was calling for, the reaction in Mexico to the coup in Honduras.
He called for President Calderon to talk to President Obama and get a stronger response for him. There was a statement about the coup calling for the restoration of constitutional order that came out of the Three Amigos Summit. However, there was no mention of President Zelaya in it, and we also had this additional comment by President Obama. In Mexico City, there was an event of grassroots organizations to listen to President Zelaya speak, and there was a lot of identification among those people with the struggle that's going on in Honduras because of what they still feel was a stolen election in Mexico in the year 2006. He talked a lot about citizen power and the need to build democracies that are not just based on representation and voting every so often, but also on participation and participatory democracy. And that was exactly what the national survey that was planned for June 28th that led to his ouster was all about. People voting on whether they wanted to call a constitutional assembly, not to end term limits, but to hold a constitutional assembly to reform the Constitution.
The issue that you were saying of it's not about the United States invading Honduras against the coup regime, but just the level of financial support it gives when we're speaking to Juan Almendarez, who actually ran against President Zelaya in the last election, but is opposed to the coup, a Honduran peace activist. He called Honduras a U.S.-occupied country. The level to which the economy of Honduras depends on the United States, and the smallest amount of economic pressure could bring down the coup regime, Laura.
Yeah, that's true. And what President Zelaya said here in Mexico, and I was in that audience, was that if the United States actually took a firm stance in cutting off military aid and cutting off other types of aid, that the coup wouldn't last 5 minutes. He said 70% of the economy is dependent on the United States. And to have that cut off, the money that's still in the pipelines, would be a significant blow to the coup, which has held on despite this unanimous international condemnation and the protests in the streets in Honduras so far. So this is very important for the Honduran movement and to end this illegal situation. And the United States does have considerable power in its hands that does not require intervention. It simply requires following the law and cutting off aid to an illegal government.
We're going to